All right, let's go ahead and get started. This is Bonnie McFarland. Once again, welcome to day 2 of our Schoolsite Council Advisory Committee and School Plan Workshop. Welcome back to those of you who joined us yesterday, and welcome anew to those of you who are joining us just for today. Yesterday, we focused on Schoolsite Councils and Advisory Committees, and today we're going to look specifically at school plans and planning requirements. This is going to be a bit longer, as we mentioned yesterday, because we're going to go a little bit more in depth into the planning process. So we'll end at 4:30 and we'll have a short break partway through. We reviewed your questions from yesterday, and we'll be getting out a Q&A to you. However, I think you'll find that some of your questions will be answered today as part of today's presentation, so hope that helps. The slides in the recording from yesterday are already posted on our website, and you can find that link in the chat, and today's slides are also posted there, and we'll be posting a recording of today's meeting also after the meeting. So today joining us is our full team: Rachel Garcia, Debbie Kano, Adrian Balcazar, and Jeannie Keith. So here are some of the topics we're going to be talking about. And as you can see, we're going to be addressing all aspects of school plans and the planning process. The overall requirements in Education Code for the school plan for student achievement. We'll look specifically at school-wide plans and planning requirements related to that. Some of the components of the planning process: the comprehensive needs assessment, the requirement for evidence-based interventions, and assessing resource inequities will be something we'll spend some time on. Then we'll go through the steps, what it looks like in terms of developing the plan. And finally, we'll take a look at specific plan requirements for comprehensive and targeted support and improvement plans, and the connection between federal plans, state plans, and the school plans. So your LCAP, your federal addendum, and the school plans, and how those should connect together. As usual, we'll have you put your questions in. Whoops, sorry, I skipped ahead. Just a reminder that we do have a Schoolsite Council handbook available, and it will address a number of the topics that we discussed yesterday, and there are resources in that also for you, and a flash drive that you can take away and make copies of templates and resources that you can share. So we will ask you to put your questions in the chat, and again, we'll answer them in the Q&A, and those that we don't get answered today. So please put your questions in there, and we will research them and respond to them. So I'm going to turn it over now to Rachel Garcia, who's going to give you an overview of the school plan and plan requirements. Rachel?
Thank you, Bonnie. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Bonnie mentioned, in this section, we'll be taking a look at the requirements for school plans. So the spirit and the intent behind the school plan for student achievement is a cycle of continuous improvement. It's an ongoing cyclical process where schools evaluate outcomes and progress toward goals, engage in strategic planning with stakeholders based on a comprehensive needs assessment, and implement evidence-based actions in an overall effort to improve the educational programs and student achievement at the school. School-level SPSA development should also be in alignment with the district-level LCAP process. And the CDE has developed a web page for planning for the LCAP and SPSA to support an integrated approach to planning embedded in the context of continuous improvement. And for your reference, we've included the link to the CDE webpage at the bottom of the slide. So which schools must develop a SPSA? SPSAs are required for Title I schools that operate a school-wide program per federal ESSA requirements. LEAs may also require that its schools develop a school plan. For example, a district might have some schools that are Title I and some that are not. And the district may require all of its schools to develop a SPSA regardless of Title I status. Lastly, SPSAs may serve as school improvement plans that are required under federal law for schools that are identified for targeted support or comprehensive support under ESSA. So that would be for CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools. So there are a number of legal requirements for school plans at both the state and the federal level. And state requirements for a SPSA are established in Ed Code 64001. In the Ed Code, it states that a local educational agency shall ensure in the consolidated application that the SPSA has been prepared in accordance with the law, and that school site councils have developed and approved a SPSA for each school participating in programs funded through the consolidated application process. And also that SPSAs were developed with the review, certification, and advice of the School English Learner Advisory Committee if required. The Ed Code also requires the SPSAs to be reviewed and approved by the governing board or body of the local educational agency at a regularly scheduled meeting whenever there are material changes. We sometimes get questions about what is considered a material change, and Ed Code does not define material change. Any change in budget and related program services that might raise questions or mislead stakeholders should be considered material. Also, a 10% budget change in a line item is also typically used as a rule of thumb for determining what constitutes a material change. However, depending on the amount budgeted, the impact of a 10% change may have greater or less significance. Education Code 64001 also specifies that the development of the school plan shall include a comprehensive needs assessment and the identification of the process for evaluating and monitoring the plan. So school site council is responsible for the development of the school plan and must therefore be involved in both of these processes. And it's also important to note that school site council minutes should document how the school site council was involved in both of these components. The content required to be included in the SPSA are goals, evidence-based strategies, actions, or services, and proposed expenditures, including the identification of resource inequities. So the SPSA goals must address the needs of students and student groups based on findings of the comprehensive needs assessment. And the strategies, actions, and services included in the plan must be evidence-based and again address the student needs as determined through the needs assessment process. Finally, the SPSA must also include proposed expenditures to address the findings of the needs assessment. And again, this includes identifying resource inequities. So essentially, everything should be aligned to the comprehensive needs assessment, which is why it is considered the foundation of the school plan. And we'll be taking a deeper look at the comprehensive needs assessment process a little later in the presentation. As mentioned, there are legal requirements for school plans at both the state and federal levels. And this chart highlights key state and federal requirements for school plans with regards to who is responsible for the development of the plan, when the plan should be reviewed and updated, and also what components must be included in the plan. The first column lists state requirements per education code. The second column in this chart lists federal requirements for Title I school-wide programs under ESSA. And the last column identifies federal improvement plan requirements for schools identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI under ESSA. It's also important to note that Ed Code allows for the SPSA to serve as the improvement plan for CSI, TSI, and ATSI, as long as they meet the federal requirements. So if you have a school that is a Title I school-wide school and has been identified for CSI, the school is responsible for the components listed in all three columns in this chart. However, you can see that most of the requirements are in alignment. For example, a needs assessment is required for school plans per California Education Code, and also for school-wide programs per ESSA, as well as for schools identified for CSI. So the next two slides are only applicable to single school districts and charter schools. Education Code 64001J allows for single school districts and charter schools to use the LCAP to serve as the SPSA, as long as the plan meets federal school planning requirements and the stakeholder requirements established in Education Code 52062A, and the plan is adopted at a public hearing. There are several considerations for a single school district or charter school when determining whether this option would best support your needs. So for example, if you select this option, the federal school planning requirements referenced in the chart on the previous slide would need to be included in the LCAP. Title I funded actions and budgeted expenditures must also be included in the LCAP. Schools would need to demonstrate in the LCAP how Title I funded actions are based on a comprehensive needs assessment to support the most at-risk students. And as mentioned, the additional stakeholder requirements per Ed Code 52062A would need to be met. As noted on the slide, this option was not available for the 2020-21 school year. Since there was not a 2020-21 LCAP, single school districts and charter schools were required to develop a SPSA for the 2020-21 school year. However, with the 21-22 LCAP, charter schools had the option to use it as its SPSA for this school year, provided that the requirements just described were met. So here we've included a chart that highlights the two different options available to single school districts and charter schools. So for option one, if you're using the LCAP as your SPSA, first off, you must consult with the required groups in developing the LCAP. And for charter schools, that includes teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, parents, and students. A school site council is not required if you're using the LCAP as your SPSA. And as mentioned on the previous slide, all federal school planning requirements must be included within the LCAP. The last four bulleted items listed, which are bolded on the left, are the additional stakeholder requirements per Education Code 52062A that are triggered if you're using the LCAP as your SPSA. So this includes, first off, you would need to establish a parent advisory committee, and the LCAP would need to be presented to that committee for review and comment. And a response would need to be provided in writing to the committee's comments. You would also need to establish an English Learner Parent Advisory Committee if you have an enrollment of at least 15% English learners and at least 50 English learners. Again, the LCAP would also need to be presented to the English Learner Parent Advisory Committee for review and comment. And also a response would need to be provided in writing to any comments received from the committee. You would also need to consult with your Special Education Local Plan Area Administrator or SELPA. And lastly, you would also be required to notify the public of the opportunity to submit written comments regarding proposed actions and expenditures in the LCAP. With option two, if you're not using the LCAP as your SPSA, you would then have two separate plans, an LCAP and a SPSA. For the development of the LCAP, you would need to consult with the required groups, which again for charter schools include teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, parents, and students. And with this option, a school site council is required for the development of the SPSA. So again, for single school districts or charter schools, you would need to determine which option would best support your site's needs. It's important to note that statute does not specify a timeline or deadline for when the development and approval of the SPSA must occur. This is a local decision consistent with the needs of the school and the local community. This slide lists some considerations that are dependent on your district or school. For example, the timing around the availability of data and budgets, like when schools receive information about budgets that will allow them to plan for proposed expenditures, or when data is available for schools to be able to measure the effectiveness of their actions. Perhaps the process schools are guided to use in terms of adjustments to plans and budgets may play a role in the timeline. Or also the election and training process for school site council members. Or the timeline of the LCAP may play a role to ensure alignment with the SPSA. So although there's no required timeline or deadline, it's important to keep in mind that you must have an approved plan to expend funds. And one other important note is that for CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools, the CDE has indicated that it is the expectation that CSI, TSI, and ATSI plans are fully developed and approved at the local level no later than the first day of the school year. Also, there is no required template for the SPSA. The important thing is that the plan template you use meets the state and federal requirements for school plans. The CDE has developed an optional template for SPSAs, and the CDE template is similar in style and format to the old LCAP template. It's important to be aware that the process of developing the SPSA is equally important, and a school will want to keep evidence of the comprehensive needs assessment, development and approval by the school site council, advisement of the ELAC, as well as your annual evaluation process. And these requirements are also reviewed through the FPM process. And with that, I will now turn it over to Adrienne for Title I Schoolwide programs.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. With the Schoolwide program, a Schoolwide program is a comprehensive program intended to improve outcomes for all students in a Title I Part A school. There are two types of Title I school programs. There is the Targeted Assistance School model and the Schoolwide program model. The Targeted Assistance School model is the default program for Title I schools. In the Targeted Assistance School program, services are provided to eligible students based on multiple objective, academically related criteria. And these services must be supplemental to what is being provided to all students at that school. And remember, all activities, strategies, and interventions must be evidence-based. The other Title I model is a school-wide program. And the purpose of a school-wide program is to improve the academic achievement throughout the school for all students, especially the lowest achieving students. A school must meet eligibility requirements in order to implement a school-wide program at that particular site. A school is eligible if the school serves a school attendance area in which not less than 40% of the children are from low-income families, or not less than 40% of the children enrolled in that school are from low-income families. If a targeted assistance school meets the eligibility criteria, then they can decide to move to a school-wide program. The school-wide program requires, though, these steps to be followed: a year-long planning process, a comprehensive needs assessment, a school-wide plan, and an annual evaluation. In a school-wide program, the school does not require the identification of individual students for services as required in the targeted assistance school model. And The allowability of costs for services is based mainly on the school plan and the comprehensive needs assessment. Before this long year planning can occur, though, the district must determine if a school is ready to implement a school-wide program. These questions need to be asked. What is the current status of the current Title I program? What is the school's understanding of the differences between targeted and school-wide programs? Are they grounded in understanding the difference? And how will the school-wide program improve the academic achievement specifically for the lowest performing students? And so how do you determine if a school is ready to upgrade the entire educational program? Here is a tool we created, a readiness rubric, to help districts determine if a school is ready to transition to a school-wide program. And this rubric also determines what level of support may be needed from the district leadership throughout this transition process. In step 1 of determining if a school is ready, this readiness rubric will look and reflect on the leadership at the school, the vision and mission of the school, and its level of articulation and implementation. It will look at the collaboration among the staff. Is there collaboration among the staff? And what does that look like? What is the school's level of commitment to equity? And how does the school use data to drive instruction? Is it systemic or is it only a certain grade level? And does the school have a planning process already in place, or does one need to be created, or one that exists needs to be modified? And lastly, is there differentiation in classroom instruction happening in the classrooms to meet the needs of all students? Or again, is it specific teachers or is it specific grade levels? Again, systemically, how prepared is the school ready to move to a school-wide program model? Step 2 is the comprehensive needs assessment. And once the district has determined that the school is indeed ready, the school will need to begin the process of the comprehensive needs assessment. The comprehensive needs assessment takes into account the entire school's information on the academic achievement of students in relation to the state academic standards. And it takes a deeper look at the needs of the failing or at risk of failing students. Step 3, a school-wide plan. Once the comprehensive needs assessment has been completed, the school will now need to develop a school-wide plan. The Title I school-wide plan must include these required components: the comprehensive needs assessment, the plan development input and process, the plan content, which would include the strategies, the actions, and the services, the annual evaluation, the plan budget, and if you are consolidating other programs, you would have a list of those programs included as well. When developing the school-wide plan, it's important to remember that there are specific authorized uses of the Title I funds. It's important for the school and everyone at the school site to understand that once you go school-wide, it's not a pot of money to be used on anything for the school. On CDE's website, you can find this webpage that explains the criteria for an allowable expenditure with Title I funds. This slide shows what applies to both targeted assistance schools as well as school-wide program schools. The activities and expenditures must be aligned to the state academic content standards. They must be evidence-based educational strategies. The activity or expenditure must be reasonable, necessary, and allocable cost to the program. It must supplement, especially for some of the programs, in the absence of such funds made from state and local sources, and they do not supplant such funds. And the intent is that these Title I Part A funds are to be used during the current federal fiscal year or the subsequent fiscal year. It's not to be held on to. In addition, if your school is a school-wide program, in addition to those first 5 items on the previous slide, this slide applies to the schools that are a school-wide program, and criteria 6 through 10 shows how the activities or expenditures must meet an identified need from your comprehensive needs assessment, and it is included in your school plan, and that the plan has been approved by your local governing board, and that your school site council will be able to annually evaluate and monitor the implementation of these activities stated within the school plan. So when if you're running a school-wide program and you looked at 1 through 10, you must be able to say yes to all of these, that you can have all of these requirements fulfilled. If your program is a targeted assistance school model, then you will follow numbers 1 through 5 on the 2 slides before, and you will follow numbers 11 through 13 on this slide. In a targeted assistance school, the activities are for specifically identified students that, again, are based on the multiple educationally related criteria that you have determined, and that the progress of these specific students must be reviewed on an ongoing basis in order to annually revise the Title I program. So it's student specific in making sure that these students are moving academically. So again, if an expenditure or an activity does not meet all of the stated rationale in these slides, then it is most likely not an authorized use of Title I Part A funds. The last requirement for a school-wide program is number 4, the annual evaluation. And the school site council must annually evaluate the progress of the programs or the activities towards accomplishing the goals in the plan. It must be determined whether the needs of all students have been met by the strategies that were used, and especially on the needs of low achieving students. And now Rachel is going to go over the comprehensive needs assessment process.
Thank you, Adrienne. So what is a comprehensive needs assessment? We often get this question followed by the question, do you have a template that we can follow? At its most basic, a comprehensive needs assessment is a process or procedure that is used to identify and address factors between current outcomes and desired outcomes. This process must include steps to provide clarity about the current situation and then identify what is needed to attain the desired student outcomes. The goal of the needs assessment is to help educators identify, understand, and prioritize the needs that the district or schools must address to improve student outcomes. It's important to note that the findings yielded through a comprehensive needs assessment are only as accurate as long as the LEA or school context remains the same. Given the current situation with the pandemic, it's very likely that student needs have greatly increased and are drastically different when compared to what the needs were pre-pandemic. So this context really stresses the importance of conducting a comprehensive needs assessment. A needs assessment for improvement is a systemic process to identify the strengths and weaknesses within the context and constraints of the school, and to dig deeper into root causes. Identifying areas of weakness is an essential first step toward identifying and addressing root causes of poor performance. And root cause analysis is an important part of the needs assessment process because it addresses the problem rather than the symptoms of the problem. The needs assessment process leads to the development of a plan to improve student outcomes. So a needs assessment for improvement is not an isolated tool or practice. Essentially, it's the first step in the continuous improvement cycle, which includes understanding root causes that contribute to the prioritized needs. and selecting evidence-based interventions that address those needs. Also preparing for and implementing selected strategies and interventions. And then evaluating whether or not those strategies are working in addressing the needs. As previously mentioned, the needs assessment is the foundation of the school plan. All strategies and actions should be informed by and aligned with the data. And implementing a successful needs assessment leads to aligned acts of school improvement rather than random acts. So there is not one correct way to conduct a comprehensive needs assessment. And it's important to keep in mind that the needs assessment is a process. One resource that highlights a needs assessment process is the State Support Network Needs Assessment Guidebook, produced by the American Institute for Research under the U.S. Department of Education. This guidebook supports the development and facilitation of a needs assessment and lays out 5 phases of needs assessment implementation. These 5 phases include planning, collecting and organizing data, interpreting information, determining priorities, and lastly, connecting to implementation. The guidebook also provides guiding questions and key considerations for each phase of the needs assessment process. And we've included the link to this resource on the bottom of the slide. So the planning phase lays the groundwork for the rest of the needs assessment process. It involves defining the desired outcomes and creating a plan to achieve them. So some key questions to consider during the planning phase include, why are we engaging in the needs assessment? Who are the key stakeholders? And how will they be engaged in the process? And at what points in the process? What core topics will the needs assessment cover? So for example, will it include instruction, assessment, achievement, or school climate? And how will the results be shared with stakeholders? Data is a foundational component of the needs assessment process. And the second phase involves collecting various forms of data and organizing it in a way that is understandable and useful for stakeholders who will be involved in the process and interpreting the data. So some of the key questions to consider during this phase include the following. What data is readily available from existing sources? So for example, that might include CASP data, LPAC data, graduation rate, attendance, or local assessment data. What additional data is needed, and what are the best ways to collect this data? Examples might include survey data, observations, focus groups, or also interviews. And how will the data be presented so that it is understood by stakeholders? The next phase is interpreting information. During this phase, stakeholders examine data to draw conclusions, identify trends, and begin to identify improvement needs. And some key questions to consider during this phase include, what does the data reveal? What are the strengths and the challenges of the current school program? Were there any themes or trends that emerged? Does the evidence gathered support staff assumptions about strengths and needs? And how can we articulate what we have learned without casting blame? So through the needs assessment process, it's very likely that multiple needs or concerns will emerge. And this phase involves prioritizing those needs so that the improvement efforts are directed toward a manageable set of priorities. So some of the key questions to consider during this phase include, what findings or themes have emerged that, if addressed, will have the greatest potential for impact on student outcomes? How many priorities can the school or district realistically address simultaneously? And is additional data needed to make informed decisions about priorities or capacity for implementation? The final phase of the needs assessment process takes those results and turns those results into something actionable. During this phase, stakeholders dig deeper to understand root causes of prioritized needs so that they can be connected to relevant goals. The process of understanding the root causes of prioritized needs also informs the selection of appropriate evidence-based interventions. And so some key questions to consider during this phase include, what are the potential underlying root causes of the prioritized needs or concerns? And how will the school connect needs assessment results to the selection of evidence-based interventions and the implementation of those interventions? So here on this slide, you see a tool that we created to summarize the needs assessment process and findings. Per the Code of Federal Regulations, schools operating a Title I school-wide program must document how the needs assessment was conducted, the results it obtained, as well as the conclusions it drew from those results. And so this tool would serve that purpose by summarizing who was involved in the process and how, also identifying the data that was reviewed, the results of the data, the conclusions drawn, as well as the prioritized needs and the potential root causes of those needs. Some districts require schools to include a summary of the needs assessment process and findings within the school plan. Schools must document the process and findings, whether it's included in the school plan or in a separate document. So again, it's important to note that a comprehensive needs assessment is not a thing or a document, but rather a process. So this document is not a needs assessment, but rather a tool to document your process and the findings from that process. So lastly, district leaders need to determine what level of support is needed with the comprehensive needs assessment. And it's likely that schools will be in different places and need different levels of support. So some ways that districts could support schools with the comprehensive needs assessment process could include ensuring that schools understand what the comprehensive needs assessment is, as well as its purpose, training school administrators and school site councils on how to conduct a comprehensive needs assessment, and also supporting school administrators and school site councils in understanding the dashboard, data analysis, and how to conduct a root cause analysis. And so next, I will turn it over to Debbie for evidence-based interventions.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so we're going to evidence-based intervention. So once you've conducted your needs assessment and identified where you're going to start and what you're going to target based on that data, you are going to be looking for an evidence-based intervention. So that's what we're going to discuss now. Next slide, please. Evidence-based interventions are practices or programs that have evidence to show that they are effective at producing results and improving outcomes when implemented correctly or as intended. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act has consistently directed educators to implement interventions grounded in research. Back under No Child Left Behind, districts and schools were called to use scientifically based research as the foundation for education programs and interventions. This was replaced by evidence-based interventions under the Every Student Succeeds Act. This shift was designed to help increase the impact of educational investments by ensuring that interventions being implemented have have proven to be effective in leading to the desired outcomes, namely improving student achievement. The requirement for evidence-based interventions does not require the LEA to conduct their own research, but instead the LEA must plan to implement interventions, strategies, and approaches that have demonstrated effectiveness by prior studies. Next, please. Next slide. Evidence-based interventions have a definitive evidence to show that they are effective. Many ESSA programs encourage state educational agencies, local educational agencies, and schools to prioritize and include evidence-based interventions, strategies, and approaches. They rank, if you will, these tiers of evidence for these evidence-based interventions, and there's a continuum. So the tiers of evidence ratings are determined by the research study criteria. The more controlled criteria provide an increase in the strength of the evidence. So a tier 1 is strong evidence and is the highest level of evidence available. To qualify as having high level of evidence, the intervention must have at least one well-designed and well-implemented experimental study to support it. So this means that a randomized control experiment occurred with a treatment group that received the intervention and a control group in comparison that did not receive the intervention, and participants in each group were randomly assigned. They must have been a large or multi-site sample with at least 350 participants, and they had to have statistically significant effects on the student or other relevant outcomes that the researchers found in the effects of the intervention were noteworthy and directly related to the intervention's implementation. The need to ensure the intervention has relevance to the specific context and similar student population in similar settings and target student populations and settings. For a tier 2 or moderate evidence, they must have at least one well-designed and well-implemented quasi-experimental study to support it. A control experiment with treatment group was conducted with a group that received the intervention and a control group that did not. Participants in these groups are not randomly assigned, so the comparison group might not take into account the impact of factors such as socioeconomic status, gender, self-selection to not participate, and etc. So while there may be a group to compare, it may not be as comparable a group created through random assignment. For tier 2 moderate evidence, this must also be large sample, multi-site with at least 350 participants. It also needs to have a statistically significant effect on the students with relevant outcomes, and the effect of the interventions must be noteworthy and directly related to the implementation of the intervention. And it should lead to favorable results like increasing student achievement. And the tier 3, which would be considered promising evidence, they must have at least one well-designed and well-implemented correlational study to support it. A study, not an experiment, took place to determine if a relationship exists between the intervention and a given outcome. This is usually done through data collection and analysis. Within the correlation study, the interventions must have shown that they had statistically significant effect on the students that were directly related to the implementation of the intervention with noteworthy favorable results for students. The need to ensure that the intervention had relevance, and due to the design of correlation study, the evidence produced is not as strong as the other two tiers 1 or 2 in the random controlled or quasi-experimental. And then tier 4 involves interventions that demonstrate a rationale. So these interventions have a clear and effective logic model or theory of action, which explains how the intervention is likely to improve relevant outcomes. They are supported by research, and there is an effort in place by the state, district, charter, or outside research organization to determine their effectiveness. Next slide, please. So section 8101 of the Elementary Secondary Education Act defines the distinction between evidence-based strategies that have been proven to have been statistically significant and those that demonstrate a rationale or likelihood. And this continuum is from tier 1 through 4 that demonstrates a significant effect, strong evidence, moderate evidence, or promising evidence, and demonstrating a rationale. So evidence-based interventions can be anywhere along this continuum. Next slide. In the next several slides, we're going to share some resources to support connections to evidence. On this slide, this is a 13-minute video, which we aren't going to play, posted about using and generating and sharing evidence-based intervention to support students. In federal guidance addressing using evidence strength education investment, the ESSA emphasizes the use of evidence-based activities, strategies, and interventions, which is collectively referred to as interventions. This guidance is designed to help SCAs, LEAs, schools, educators, and partner organizations and other educational partners how to successfully choose and implement interventions that improve outcomes for students. There are 2 parts to this guidance. Part 1 of this guidance reviews the steps for effective decision-making in the cycle of continuous improvement. And part 2 of the guidance recommends considerations, resources, and criteria for evidence-based intervention based on ESSA's 4 evidence levels. Next slide, please. Some databases that provide ratings for evidence-based programs and practices are included on the CDE website, such as Evidence for ESSA database through Johns Hopkins University for Research and Reform in Education. We have links here for you. Then there's also the What Works Clearinghouse in an initiative of the Institute of Education Sciences through the U.S. Department of Education. And additionally, a document is included highlighting evidence-based strategies specifically to high school. These resources are the result of using rigorous standards to review evidence of effectiveness on a wide range of interventions, and also summarizes the settings and populations in the study. So keep in mind that your local capacity also helps to predict the success of an intervention. So you must consider your available funds, staff resources, staff skill, and the supports available to support intervention implementation. When you decide on selecting an evidence intervention, all of those things must be considered. And the LEA must work with schools to help build capacity to implement the evidence-based interventions. You must have clear expectations and provide professional development and all materials to implement an intervention as prescribed. Next slide, please. Here is a screenshot of the What Works Clearinghouse. This is their homepage and an initiative of the Department of Education, the Institute of Educational Science, which can be used as a resource for locating the evidence of various education interventions. Next slide. And when you go into a specific study, this is a sample of what you would, a snapshot of what a report you will find, the rating of effectiveness and improvement and whether or not the intervention met the What Works Clearinghouse standards. So you can see a sample study, a little synopsis, and then It'll give you information helping to select an intervention that would meet the criteria of your school or your needs. Next. This database aims to provide clear and authoritative information on programs that meet the ESSA evidence standards and enable educators and communities to select effective educational tools to improve student success. They have information on programs in reading, math, social emotional learning, attendance, science, and writing. So here, that's that correlation, and you have a link. Next slide, please. And here's a screenshot of the type of details this website provides for each of the programs. So again, there's a rating, the number of students in the sample, the effect size, and program description. So this is a way for you to find an intervention that meets the needs of your schools in your community. Next slide, please. And this next one is from WestEd, and it provides tools for looking at current practices as well as a tool for supporting LEAs to develop an approach for working with its schools to select evidence-based interventions. Next slide. So there's a screenshot of the document from the U.S. Department of Education, and the guidance from the U.S. Department of Education seeks to help SEAs, LEAs, schools, and educators to understand the 4 levels of evidence and recommends a step-by-step process for choosing and implementing interventions that improve outcomes for students. Again, part 1 of this guidance reviews the steps for effective decision-making in selecting evidence-based intervention, starting with engaging in a timely, meaningful consultation with your educational partners, such as families, students, educators, and community members, to examine that relevant data and to understand the most pressing needs of the school and the educators, and then the potential root causes and those needs. So that was what Rachel was referring to. And then following that needs assessment, the process then moves through the steps of selecting the relevant evidence-based intervention, considering the local district and school level resources, the plan for implementation and reflecting on the determined impact of the plan. So working through that cycle of inquiry, there's guidance for that. Next slide. I'm sorry. Part 2 of the guidance provides the definition of evidence-based intervention and determined through research and criteria applied. Part 2 of the guidance recommends considerations, resources, and criteria for identifying evidence-based interventions. The process outlined in Part 1 aligns with the requirements for district support of CSI schools, which can also benefit ATSI schools. In the LCAP plan summary section, LEAs are required to describe how the LEA supports the CSI school in developing the CSI plan that includes a school level needs assessment, evidence-based intervention, and identification of any resource inequities through the implementation of the plan. The LEA may use the process in the guidance and facilitate discussion based on some of these other tools we've shared as part of the support provided to the school and support and improvement status. So consider what is happening currently in your LEA. So in your district, what is your current approach to reviewing and selecting intervention to address the needs of your identified schools eligible for support? So how does your district's practices regarding intervention and the degree of local control impact your choice to work with schools or to conduct comprehensive needs assessment and to support schools with implementing and evaluating schools' use of evidence-based intervention? consider what past or current practices providing guidance to schools. Is there anything that you would like to keep or change, or how would you approach guidance with this new information? And with that, we are going to take a 10-minute break.
We told you today was going to be a little more dense than yesterday, but the process is there's a lot to a school-wide program to do it right and to really make it effective. There's a lot of flexibility in school-wide programs, but in the opposite side of that is that there's a lot of requirements. So we're going to delve into the next section. And by the way, I also think that Christine is going to be putting in the chat the link. I know some of you had asked the link for the publications, so if you need those. But resource inequities have been, we saw some questions already in the chat, so hopefully we'll address some of those questions. But this whole concept of resource inequity has been challenging and confusing from the beginning. So if that's how you're feeling, you're right on target. It's been a word that's put out there, a term, but without a lot of definition. And so I think we're starting to get some clarity on it and hopefully can add to that today. So, but you're also going to find there's been some confusion about it. And so we want to kind of go through why you might have some confusions about the requirements. So let's start on the next slide looking at education code. And we're going to start there with what Ed Code says about the about resource inequities. So this is where you're going to find the requirements for school plans. And what it shares is that the school plan needs to include all of the following. And we've already talked about goals for pupil outcomes based on a needs assessment, evidence-based strategies, which we just talked about, and proposed expenditures based on the projected resource allocation, and to address the findings of the needs assessment consistent with state priorities, including identifying resource inequities. So this is a requirement for all plans. We share that because resource inequities is a requirement for all school plans based on state ed code, but you're going to find some places where that's a little bit confusing. And one of them is on the next slide, the optional, and Rachel mentioned earlier that the school plan, there's no required template for the school plan. However, if you have CSI schools, you do have to have a plan that meets all the requirements. And CDE provided this optional template. And in the template, it indicates that this is only a requirement for CSI and ATSI schools. We think they're working on updating the template, but as you can see in education code, it's required for all schools. So while it's especially important for your lowest performing schools, you really want to know, are there inequities that are causing those schools to be in CSI or ATSI? That's especially important for those schools. It's something that needs to be considered for all schools. So just any confusion in the template, go back to education code. The requirement there is that this is a requirement for all schools, at least school-wide schools that require a plan. All right, next slide. So this slide provides an overview of the program requirements for CSI and ATSI schools, and this is where you find most of the definitions. So we're looking at that because it provides a definition, and it highlights the CSI requirements for resource inequities. Okay? It's doubly clear here that the identification of resource inequities is definitely required for CSI and ATSI schools. And you'll notice it looks at including a review of both district and school level budgets to address those activities through implementation of the plan. So, all right, next slide. Again, from the CSI website, what does a review of resource inequities include? Well, it states that it may include, again, a review of both LEA and school level budgets. So if there are inequities at the school, then that may require going back and looking at the LCAP which we now have that process. Well, there's nothing required in the LCAP relative to resource inequities. It would trigger a look at the LCAP to identify what resources are going to that school. We'll address the alignment of the LCAP and the school plan later in the presentation, but you can see how an analysis of inequities at the school site may have you look back to the district level plan and see how the LCAP and resources through the LCAP can support schools to address those inequities. Next, so what is a resource inequity? And when we first started thinking about this several years ago, we thought, well, shouldn't we know what resource equity means before we look at resource inequities? And it turns out we weren't alone in our thinking on that, because we've found some resources and research that address that. So resource equity is looked at as the allocation and use of resources. So it's beyond just the allocation of funds, but how are those funds being used? And those include both people, time, and money. So it's not just money, but how are the resources at the school site being used? Beyond the dollars associated, again, how are people being used? How is time being allocated? And how is that leading to an equitable outcome for students? ESSA requires that districts have a methodology for allocating resources to schools to ensure Title I schools receive all the resources they would otherwise receive if they weren't getting Title I funds. So that's a requirement in ESSA for Title I schools. The district has to show they're equitably distributing money to the schools. So that tells you it's beyond resources, because there's a basic requirement to provide resources. But let's take a look at how resources are being used. So identifying, oops, sorry. Okay, so considering, oh, okay, good, I know, how'd that go? All right, consideration of resource inequities, it can inform the assessment of the effectiveness of the actions and strategies. If you're seeing inequitable use of resources, then you need to go back and look at your actions and strategies. The paragraph here suggests that an LEA might consider a review of resource inequities as part of the LCAP process. And again, while not generally required as part of the LCAP, a question would be, if a school is experiencing, or a number of schools are experiencing inequities, is there something we at the district level should be doing, or is this a school level issue? So, continuing with the ways in which an LEA or school may review resource inequities, the CDE states we can look beyond budgeting. For example, ways in which a program may be unfair or lack inclusion. We can also look at resource allocation within districts or within schools as a potential area for concern. For example, lower quality books, materials, less access to labs, outdated technology, class size, and distribution of highly effective or experienced teachers all can be issues related to resource inequity. LEAs are asked to identify current strategies and practices that may be contributing to these inequities. These are what can be brought to light and addressed in the school planning process. So looking at fairness and inclusion on the next slide. We know that students who come to school with greater needs require greater resources to reach the same high learning outcomes. We understand that personal characteristics such as gender or ethnicity shouldn't stand as obstacles to achievement. We understand that we must hold the same high expectations for all students, and that failure to do so is an inequity in itself. Therefore, any gaps we see in student groups should be potential symptoms of a resource inequity. When we see disproportionate representation of one student group with high rates of dropouts or attendance or discipline or lack of achievement, schools are compelled to review what might be the contributing issues. What might be the conditions that might be better addressed to move toward a more equitable outcomes for all students? Okay. So since high-need students require greater resources to reach the same outcomes, providing equal resources for all might mean that the system you have has resource inequities. We wanted to share a resource with you to support you in looking at this. And this is a framework for districts and schools to review resource inequity. The Educational Resource Services developed a paper, and that paper included this framework. And the framework includes 11 dimensions of resource equity. And they developed also a set of diagnostic questions that can help schools self-assess where they are in terms of resource equity. They classified the first 7 dimensions as factors directly impacting student achievement. So if you look at teacher quality, that's got a direct impact on students. Empowering rigorous content, that also has to do with expectations. Is the content in your lower performing schools or in your Title I schools, is it rigorous, and are the expectations as high as they are in other schools? If not, that's a potential resource inequity. Instructional time and attention. Is instructional time increased? School-wide programs have a requirement for increasing instructional time. Is that happening? Early intervention. To what degree are students identified early and intervention comes quickly? Or are students sitting in class and not learning and there's no process in place to intervene? Again, that leads to an inequity. Early learning opportunities. Do students have access to preschool and other early learning supports? And is there good first teaching taking place? The next 2 have to do with a whole child approach. Are we looking at all the areas that students might be struggling with in terms of their academic and social emotional needs? And then family academic engagement. That can be also an inequity. If children don't have support from their family, who don't understand or have the ability to support them, that can also be something that leads to an inequity. And those are direct factors. The other 3, the last 3 are those that are less directly impacting, but they do have an impact. Okay, so school funding, the amount of money that goes into a school, that's not a direct perhaps impact, but it certainly indirectly affects how students are experiencing their educational program, and that's an inequity. School leadership quality. What's the quality of the leadership? We know that that makes a huge difference. Site level administrators drive what happens in schools, and so the quality of the leadership in the school affects the most impacted students the most low achieving. Diverse and inclusive schools, inclusivity, again, that's an indirect impact, but it does impact students and can be an equity issue. And then learning ready facilities. Are students in your lowest performing schools experiencing school facilities that are that meet all their needs and that are clean and accessible, have labs and all the things they need? If not, again, that's another inequity. So you can see they list a list of items to look at. And then provided here, and there's a link to this, is a list of diagnostic questions. For each of those areas, you can see there's a list of questions. So a school could go through and you could ask at the district level or at the school level. Questions can be asked about each of those that can guide you in the needs assessment process. On the next slide, we look at a sample. One of these was empowering rigorous content. So some of the questions, just so you can see them a little better here, a question about rigorous content might be, are assignments, student assignments, are they equivalent in courses equally across high and low need schools? In other words, are the expectations and the course equivalents, are they the same or are they different? Do students have access to curriculum aligned with empowering grade level standards? So are teachers teaching to the standards, or is teaching not at the level of the standards? What's the relationship between grades and state assessments? This is a great thing to look at. If you look at individual student grades and you look at their state assessments, are those matching or are grades inflated and not really indicating how students are achieving on state assessments? Do schools with higher needs students do they have AP coursework at similar levels with as schools with lower needs students? So do you have equity in terms of your AP offerings for students? Do students with similar performance levels within and across schools get placed in AP classes at the same rates, regardless of race or income? So disaggregating your data to look at those underlying causes, but these are questions that schools can ask to identify resource inequities. We just wanted to provide you another resource, and this is from a different group, the Educational Resource Equity Framework. They took the same topics, but they just organized them a little differently. And there are also resources on their website that you can use to support schools in looking at resource inequities. So you can notice that the dimensions are largely the same, but they've grouped them in a little bit different way. So you can take a look at that and see if that might be helpful to your schools in trying to make a determination if there are any inequities that need to be addressed. So this framework can be used as perhaps a discussion starter to create a common language and facilitate discussion. So LEAs and school leaders can ask themselves what it means to provide all students with an opportunity to achieve educational excellence. So at the systems level, you're looking at equity and inequity across schools, whereas at the school level, you're looking at across grade levels, across classrooms, across departments, or across student groups. So the questions would be, first of all, do these dimensions fit with your experiences and beliefs? You need to look at your school, your district. Do these kind of fit? Do they make sense in your context? How can they be incorporated into school planning, and how can they be part of the comprehensive needs assessment? Can those questions be a part of what school site councils are doing to review their school plans? What actions could be taken at the school and LEA level to address when resource inequities are identified? So you identify an inequity, how's that going to be turned into an action? And how can it be addressed in either the school plan? Is that something? Is that where it should be addressed? Should it be in the LCAP? Or should it be in a broader district decision-making process? If you're noticing inequities in your schools, particularly your lowest achieving or your high poverty schools, then that should trigger a district conversation about why are these inequities showing up in our schools and what can we do to improve it? Is it a school-based issue or is this a district issue we need to take on? So the question is, what are the next steps you would take to move forward with a discussion in your districts about how you talk with your schools and support your schools in identifying those inequities? And again, the broadening piece here is how do we look beyond just financial equity, because resources, you should have fiscal equity across your schools. That's sort of a foundation, but how do you get to a deeper look at equity? All right, so now we're going to move on to the next section, and I believe that's Jeannie is going to talk about the steps. No, I don't think it's Jeannie. We'll see who shows up here.
Thanks, Bonnie. Hi, everyone. Wow, so much information. And how do you operationalize all of that? Well, we're going to take a deeper look into the process of developing your SPSA. CDE recommends, and again, this is a recommendation that CDE says if you use a 7-step process in developing and annually reviewing your school plan, you will be able to embed all of the components that we've been sharing today in terms of operationalizing your process of developing the school plan, the SPSA. So we see that there are 7 steps. You would be analyzing student achievement data, measuring the effectiveness of the current strategies in your SPSA, identifying goals and key improvements moving forward, identifying timelines, personnel and expenditures, or making recommendations, recommending the SPSA to the your local governing board, implementing once it is approved, implementing the school plan, and then lastly, monitoring the implementation of your SPSA. So making sure that this is a continuous process, continuous improvement, and it is ongoing throughout the year. So in step one, analyzing student achievement data, it was shared earlier about looking at CAS, SBAC results, the LPAC for English learners, and right now, you know, there might be some delay in some of this achievement gap. So you might need to look at local benchmark assessments or curriculum embedded assessments in order to look at the data on your students in relation to your standards and your activities in your plan. Step two is to measure the effectiveness of the current improvement strategies. And so this is at school, as schools are conducting their needs assessment on the effectiveness of the school instructional program, making sure that the input of stakeholders are also included in this process. And again, data may be collected using site, district, or CDE developed tools that might include surveys, interviews, observations, or review of records and other documentation. Your school site council needs to be involved in this process. So you want to inform them on how to look at the relationship between what is actually currently occurring in the instructional program and what is the data actually showing your families and your parents and your teachers about the program and that's being implemented. And then also looking at that accurate assessment and having that thoughtful analysis discussion on the current instructional program is really essential in looking at analyzing how effective what's happening in these current improvement strategies. And so in step two, the SPSA must be developed with the review, advisement, and certification of the applicable school advisory committee. So again, when you're looking at this data, making sure that you involve the necessary advisory committees that have a say or would want to know the effectiveness of particular strategies or activities. Also, the advisory committees may want to submit these recommendations in writing. That's something that you would need to have to supply evidence in an FPM review. So you want to make sure there's always a paper trail. And then also too, in respect to the advisory committees, making sure that there are reflected minutes and agenda items where advisories are part of the discussion. And then in step three, identifying the goals and key improvements. Again, the LEA goals need to be articulated with the district priorities and the expectations. And so when the school is developing and looking at the school plan, these goals need to be aligned. You know, it doesn't work when the school wants to do something differently than the overarching structure and vision and mission of the whole school district. So again, making sure that the goals are aligned with the district plans, with the LCAP federal addendum. And again, these school level goals should be established once the goals are established, that the activities and the related expenditures are based on these goals. So everything is aligned. And it is a recommendation that goals be using that SMART format of specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. And again, it's a recommendation. And this format seems to be easily understood by parents and teachers and even students on your school site council, because it is concrete. It does give specific data that can be followed or addressed and used in this analysis process. Step four is defining the timelines, the personnel, the proposed expenditures, and the funding sources. So again, essentially looking and making sure that the expenditures are allowable in the plan and that they are an effective means to accomplish the purpose of the program, that they're reasonable and allocable and necessary, and that they supplement, not supplant the general program. So this means that they cannot pay for services that are required by law or services provided to ineligible students. So again, making sure that the actions and the activities that are placed in the plan are for the intended program requirements and fulfill that requirement. Then in step 5, it's the recommendation of the school plan to the local governing board. By signing the SPSA, the school site council is assuring that the school site council was properly constituted, that it had reviewed the legal responsibilities and had sought input from the required advisory committees, and that the content requirements were reviewed for all the programs that are included in the SPSA, and that formally the approved plan has been approved, so that it is asking the recommendation of approval from the local board for their review. And also to note, if the local board decides not to approve a plan or has questions about it, the board does need to provide in writing or communicate to the school site council the reason why. And then the school site council does have the opportunity to revise the SPSA and resubmit it for approval, so that this process can complete in terms of having the local board, governing board, approve the SPSA. And again, remember that the activities and expenditures are not authorized for implementation until the SPSA is revised and approved. At this time, just a reminder for your district governing boards, their role in this process is to adopt the policies as they relate to the SPSA. They are to approve or disapprove the plan, and their role is to ensure that the SPSAs are aligned to the district or LEA, and that they meet the federal funding requirements as signed in the assurances. And then the second to the last step, step 6, is to implement the SPSA. So once the SPSA has been board approved, the site and the district administration are responsible for implementing and evaluating the activities in the SPSA. Implementation of the plan includes assigning, directing, and supervising the staff attached or assigned to the activity or action, as well as providing training and information to the school site council and the advisory groups, so that they clearly know their roles and responsibilities in being able to analyze and monitor and evaluate the actions and strategies in the school plan. And then the last step, step 7, is the actual monitoring of the implementation of the SPSA. And again, the responsibility is the school site council's role to monitor the effectiveness of planned activities and modifying those that are, proven not effective. And so we shared about this step yesterday in the FPM section about CE19, school site evaluation of program effectiveness. And again, because this is something that FPM will ask for evidence in terms of the school site council and the process that you use in evaluating the effectiveness and the monitoring of the activities, it is important that you don't overlook this step. This is clearly something that not only do you want to operationalize, but you want to memorialize in your school minutes, in your agendas, in handouts, in presentations. Again, you want to make it very clear that it's not, your plan is not, sitting on the shelf somewhere, that this is indeed a living document. And now, as we talked about CSI, TSI, and ATSI, and how that relates to the SPSA or your school plan, we know that LEAs and schools must partner with the community members and stakeholders to locally develop and implement a plan to improve student outcomes. So Ed Code says that it allows the SPSA to serve as a school improvement plan for schools that have been identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI, as long as the plan includes, for CSI, the plan must be based on the school level needs assessment and informed by all state indicators. It must include evidence-based interventions, and it must identify resource inequities. So for those of you that have submitted or are part of the LCAP development team, you'll know that that portion was included in the LCAP. For schools identified as ATSI, you also have the same requirement as a CSI. And for schools identified as TSI, your plan does not require the evaluation of resource inequities. So what if your school has been identified as CSI, TSI, or ATSI, and you're not receiving Title I funds? Well, ESSA states that all CSI, TSI, ATSI identified schools are now required to develop a SPSA to address the school needs. And so then it also says that school site councils must develop the SPSA. So therefore, your school must have a compliant school site council following the composition requirements and the required process for developing the SPSA. And here is a table that explains what is required for the CSI and TSI requirements. And so, for example, if you look at the second row, which is responsibility for plan development, you can see that for CSI schools, the LEA has the responsibility for the plan development and the implementation, compared to if you look across to the TSI school, where it is the school's responsibility for the plan development and implementation. So again, this is a nice comparison, so you can see for your schools that are identified as CSI and your schools identified for TSI, and you can follow the requirements here. And then also this, as Rachel shared earlier, this table again goes over the state requirements, the federal requirements, and those additional requirements for CSI and TSI and ATSI. And so when looking at the school plan, we can see here that these three columns have the highlighted in red how the school plan is needed. And then also the evidence-based strategies, actions, and services are a requirement for the state on the state level, federal level, and for ATSI, CSI, and TSI. So, and then the identifying resource inequities, we can see that for CSI to ATSI, and also the state requirement for the SPSA for Schoolwide. And so again, making sure that you see how they are all the requirements for each of these levels.
Adrian,
yes.
Before we go on, please jump in here. I'd just like to go back to something because we saw it in the chat and you addressed it, and I appreciate that. And that was about goals and the degree to which they need to be SMART goals. And as Adrian pointed out, there's nothing in law requiring a SMART goal. But the question is, I think, about definition. And the question is, how are you defining a goal? And if your goals can be broad, lofty, those things you see in school visions and such. If that's a goal, then what you need to look at next are your outcomes. And your outcomes need to be clear enough to be able to evaluate and provide information to the school about the effectiveness of their plan. So that's where somewhere in there, whatever you call it, a goal or an outcome. Outcomes need to be clear enough, and you need to just ask the question, can I tell in June if this worked, if something happened? Is it clear enough? And then when you get to the level of actions, we talk about this in the LCAP all the time. That's where you want real clarity. You want to know, we always use the phrase, who's doing what for whom, but it needs to be clear enough for you to say, is this an allowable expenditure? Because you at the district are going to be evaluating the school plan and you have to determine that. So just kind of clarify those terms. Is it goals? What are your outcomes? Can you measure, whatever you call them, can you measure at the end of the year how well the plan was implemented, and are those something that you get to the end of the year and say, well, I don't know, this isn't very clear, or yes, it is or it isn't. So I just wanted to throw that out, but thanks for clarifying that, that there's no such thing as a SMART goal in the law, but it's smart to have outcomes that you can measure. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Bonnie. And now we will hear from Jeannie, who will discuss how the LCAP Federal Addendum, and the SPSA should be aligned and connected to your district's goals and outcomes.
Well, thank you, Adrienne, and that's the perfect introduction. So if you'd move to the next slide, that would be great. So in this section, we're attempting to provide an overview of the LCAP, the Federal Addendum, and the school plan for student achievement, and to really provide an understanding and a method for ensuring that your educational partners understand how these three pieces work together. So, the LCAP is an LEA, or district level plan. It's a plan for all students, and it describes how the LEA is supporting all students and student groups, and it addresses all of the 8 state priorities. And in addition, the LCAP must demonstrate how the LEA is providing increased or improved services for 3 specific student groups: the low-income students, English learners, and foster youth. And the LEA demonstrates how they're increasing or improving services in proportion to the additional funds they receive for those students. And so then there's also the LCAP Federal Addendum, and this is also an LEA level document, and its purpose is to describe how the LEA is meeting federal program requirements by supplementing the LEA's program that's outlined in the LCAP, and how the LEA is addressing specific provisions that are not addressed in the LCAP. And this is all enhancing what is locally provided. And then we've spent a lot of time today on the school plan for student achievement. So this is a school level plan based on a school level needs assessment. And it's describing the Title I program and how Title I funds are used to improve academic achievement at the school level, and particularly to improve the achievement of those most at risk of not meeting standards. It's essential that your school site council has an understanding of each of these pieces so they can make informed decisions about the school plan for student achievement. So let's go on to the next slide, please. And here, this slide provides a visual of the relationship of these plans. And again, you can see at the top that the LCAP is setting district priorities, goals, and outcomes. Again, this addresses all students and actions, and it addresses 8 state priorities and specific needs that are locally identified. Okay. The addendum showing how supplemental federal funds support these goals within the context of federal requirements. And the school plans describing, if it's a Title I school, how the school is using Title I funds to close achievement gaps. And we've heard today that there may be some LEAs that also require non-Title I schools to develop school plans for student achievement. So in these plans, they may be asked to describe in their plan how specific LCAP actions are being implemented at the school site. So you can see from the diagram that all of the plans are in some way connected, and we want to ensure that there's not duplication of effort and that each of the plans provides a complement to the other plan. So on the next slide, we have another chart. And you'll notice here that there's a column for the LCAP, a column for the school plan for student achievement, and a column for the addendum, the LCAP federal addendum. And so the LCAP and the SPSA, are plans, and the addendum really is a descriptor of how specific requirements not in the LCAP are addressed. And the LCAP federal addendum is completed once per the ESSA authorization, but it is updated locally, periodically, and this can be on an annual basis. And it's important that if you're updating the addendum, that you keep your community informed so that they're aware of how the LEA is addressing the provisions in the federal addendum. So in the federal addendum, LEAs provide a narrative to explain their strategy for using federal funds to supplement and enhance local priorities or initiatives that are being funded with state funds that are reflected in the LCAP. And this includes provisions that are not addressed in the LCAP, some of which include requirements for educator equity, some additional parent and family engagement requirements under Title I, as well as school plan requirements for school-wide programs and targeted support programs, as well as reservations for homeless youth and specific requirements. Additionally, in the LCAP federal addendum, LEAs describe their use of funds for Title II, III, and IV. And so it's important that district and school site personnel and educational partners are aware of what's being provided in the LCAP and any updates to the federal addendum so that school planning can build on existing services. Next slide, please. This slide shows the CDE website, and Rachel showed this earlier. And here there's a page titled Planning for LCAP and SPSA. And here the CDE really emphasizes how planning for LCAP and the school plan for student achievement can be aligned. And so they explain how the design of the optional CDE SPSA template intentionally mirrors some language from the prior LCAP template. And this is done by using some common vocabulary. And here the intent is that each of the templates, LCAP template and the SPSA template, are designed to reflect a planning process based on a continuous improvement process where educational partners engage in a needs assessment and an analysis to determine needs, and then develop strategies to address those needs and include outcomes to support reflection on the effectiveness of their implementation. And on this website, there's a lot of support for each of the components in the that are identified in the continuous improvement planning process. Next slide, please. It's important to note, and you've heard about this requirement on the slide this afternoon, that per statute, the superintendent of the school district is required to review school-wide school plans for student achievement. This alignment is supported with the requirement embedded in the LCAP approval process for superintendents to review school plans to ensure that actions in the LCAP are consistent with strategies in school plans. And so what does this mean, and how does it really happen? So it's important that there is some type of an iterative process where information can flow back and forth from the school and the LEA and from the LEA to the school so that the needs assessment and annual evaluation processes from the schools and the LEA are aligned, so that decisions can best address the site and LEA level needs. This iterative process will inform schools about services that are being provided by the LEA, and likewise will inform the LEA about common needs that need to be addressed at school site. This back and forth will ensure that resources can most effectively be leveraged and avoid duplication of effort. What does this process look like in your LEA? Next slide, please. And so we're going to conclude today with this concept of an ongoing process, which is really critical to the work of developing and implementing and evaluating a school plan for student achievement, as well as an LCAP. And so instead of a one-time year-end review of school plans, there should be an ongoing process to identify school level and LEA level needs. LEAs can begin by aligning timelines so that schools and LEAs are talking about the same things at the same time. Next, LEAs can implement a process so LEA staff have their ear to the ground during school plan development. This way, district staff working on the LCAP can be aware of needs arising from schools during the SPSA needs assessment process. Then, if resource inequities are identified, LEA staff can be aware of that and determine if they should be best addressed at the school site or if they would be better addressed in the LCAP. Additionally, if common needs are arising across schools, perhaps that should be addressed district-wide rather than school by school. Additionally, LEA support in the process at school sites can assist in determining if there are gaps in mandated services or basic services for all students that need to be addressed at the district level. So really aligning the time for the school plan process with the LCAP process is something to consider that may be helpful in assisting with sharing information up from the school sites to the LEA and vice versa, down from the LEA to the school sites. And with that, we're going to wrap up almost on time. We have a few minutes left to leave the chat open for questions and answers. We will follow up with the Q&A. And on behalf of the team, I thank you for joining us this afternoon and yesterday. Thank you.